Cool. I think the camera's working. Cool. Everyone, I guess we're ready to start. Hod will introduce me via a little screen. Here you go, Hod.
Okay, cool. Everybody, there's no food.
There's food. It's in the back. You can't see it.
I can't see it. All right. So hello, everybody. I will remotely initiate this PhD defense. So welcome, everybody. We'll do it. I think most of the examiners are at this point remote, so it's going to be an interesting remote process. But we'll begin. So we'll do it the usual way. Jason will begin by giving a presentation. We'll have a open presentation Q&A. Feel free to ask any questions during or at the end. Once we're done, we'll shift to more the closed session. We'll do a little bit more of the examination part, and hopefully that will conclude the process. So, Jason, take it away.
Thanks, Hod. I'll turn you back around. Is that a pretty good angle? Okay, cool. So hi everyone, welcome to my B exam. My name is Jason Lusinski, as Hod mentioned. Today I'm going to talk to you about some progress toward improving AI in general. So AI is kind of a hard problem that people have been working on for quite a long time, actually for the better part of a century. So as early as 1950, we have Alan Turing defining his famous Turing test for one notion of what might mean we've kind of reached some state of AI. Namely, if you have a computer that's able to kind of converse with a human in a text-based form and convince the human that it's also a human, then maybe we've achieved some measure of AI. But again, this is quite a few decades ago. In 1966, Marvin Minsky sort of famously took a webcam, hooked it up to a computer, and assigned to a couple of undergraduates as a summer project, write some algorithms that can look at this picture and from the pixels, like detect what's in the picture. Just do basic object detection. Should be pretty simple. Hopefully you can finish this by the end of the summer. And now there's this XKCD about this sort of process, how much harder this sort of thing can be than it appears at first. So this programmer is building an app for taking pictures in a national park. And he says, hey, when a user takes a photo, the app should check whether they're in a national park or not. And they say, okay, simple. We'll just look up the GPS coordinates and tell you if they're in a park. Oh, and also they should check whether the photo is of a bird or not. He says, okay, well, I'll need a research team in 5 years. So it turns out from 1966, it took many, many more than 5 years to have robust object detection, which was sort of surprising for people back then that it took so long. So basically, for the last 5 or so decades, there was not as much progress as many people would have hoped. But then something kind of cool happened. So right around in the last decade or so, the last 10 years, maybe since 2005, there was a lot of progress. And the progress came from several directions. I'll talk about that in a second. So among other things, we can now sort of converse with our phones. If you have Apple iPhones with Siri or Android, you can say something like, okay, Google, tell me what the weather is on Sunday. I'm actually just kind of doing that now. And it will recognize your voice, and it will transcribe what you're saying to text and figure out what you mean and answer your question. So this is sort of, I'm not saying this is passing the Turing test, but it's a huge step in the direction of passing some tests like this. And this is only possible in the last few years. On the computer vision side, we've also seen really amazing progress. So here's a video shown by Jensen Huang at the NVIDIA keynote a few weeks ago. So they have a driverless car that navigates purely based on pixel input. So given a bunch of pixels, it can figure out kind of if a human had seen these pixels, would the human have turned left or right? And it can navigate in rain and so on and so forth. Actually, other companies are also working on driverless cars. But basically, within the last few years, this is kind of working very well, but it took quite a long time. And I'm sure many of you saw also DeepMind's AlphaGo program recently beating the world, or one of the world reigning champions, 4-1 at matches of Go. Here's the final winning move for AlphaGo in the first match. So all three of these sort of advances have been possible only in the last decade or so, and all have been possible through the use of neural networks, which is what my research is about. For those not familiar, I'll give a very brief introduction to neural networks. For those familiar, I'm sorry if you're bored for 3 minutes, but I just want to talk a little bit about what neural networks are, their properties, and so on. So very loosely speaking, neural networks are models that are based on like a rough approximation of a couple properties of computation that goes on in a human brain. So if you, or any mammalian brain, I guess. So if you zoom into a mammalian brain, you would see basic computational units called neurons. They have a few properties which we're going to seek to copy. So basically, they take input from a relatively small number of their neighbors, rather than being connected to the entire rest of the brain. They then perform locally some fairly simple computation, or at least we think we can do a lot with fairly simple computation locally. And then they take the results of that computation and they pass it on for others to use as input information for their own calculations. And we basically have many of these units connected together. So they're individually very simple. We connect them in a big network, and then the whole network could do something cool, could do something complicated when they're all together. So we're going to seek to copy these 4 properties into artificial neural networks, which are composed of units that take a number of inputs from other nodes, perform some basic computation internally. This is often as simple as a weighted sum followed by some nonlinearity. And then they pass on information to other units for use in their computation. I should note, of course, in real brains, there's a lot of other stuff that goes on. So there's the procedures by which neurons are kind of born and die and learn, and connections change and strengthen and weaken and so on. And there's complicated biological dynamical processes. And we're not going to try to copy any of that at all. We're just copying these couple of basic properties. We're going to see how far we can get with that. So to make this a little bit more concrete, we're going to consider a simple example of something called image classification. So let's imagine you have some pictures of dogs and cats, and you'd like to design a neural network to be able to tell the dogs apart from the cats. So this is how we might solve such a problem. First, we take each picture and we convert it to just a big long list of numbers, where each number corresponds to kind of the brightness of one pixel. So we have a bright pixel in the top corner and less bright pixel here. That's just this big long list of numbers. We identify these pixels, these numbers, with what we call input neurons on an input layer. So here the neuron takes the value associated with each pixel. So high if it's bright, low if it's not, and so on. Then, so this is kind of like the input data. To enable some computation to take place, we add additional neurons called hidden units, hidden neurons. And we take, so here's one for example, and we connect that to some or all of the input layer. And each of these connections we're going to allow to have some weight. So maybe the connection weight from this hidden unit to here is 1.2, and this is 0.7, and this is minus something, and so on. And for now, let's just imagine we don't know what those weights should be, so we just set them all randomly. So we make a bunch of connections, randomly set the weights, and proceed. So this will perform a little bit of computation, but we want to perform some more, so we add other units as well with their own connections and their own weights. And we kind of repeat this procedure until we have a lot of units that are connected to the input. So we're going to call this the first layer, first hidden layer maybe. And so all of these units see the input and they perform some basic computation on it. In general, we will just consider all these weights to be kind of one long list of parameters, which we call theta often. So this is basically a block of numbers that determines the computation. So if I told you theta and the calculation rule used inside, you could specify, you could kind of write down what computation will be performed by this network. Of course, the computation is fairly simple because all that you can do is sort of take a dot product and apply nonlinearity. So in practice, what we need to do to enable more complicated computation is to stack layers on top of each other. So here we have a second layer that takes input from the first layer, and we could eventually have a third layer that takes input from the second, and so on. And as you add layers, you add nonlinearities, and you add complexity, you add more parameters, and you enable more complicated computation. Okay, to go back to our simple example, let's say we want to just distinguish dogs from cats. To solve this problem, we might eventually designate a special neuron called an output neuron, and we would assign this unit some semantic meaning. So far, these kind of are associated with pixels. We don't know what these intermediate nodes mean, and the final node we're going to say it has a specific meaning. In particular, we might say this neuron should fire with a signal of -1 for dog and +1 for cat. So we just assign it some meaning. So initially, let's imagine we stick a picture of a dog into this network. Initially, because all the parameters are random, it's going to be just some type of garbage output. So you're doing random computation. Instead of outputting -1, it'll output 7, or something very wrong. If you put a cat in, it might output -3, so quite incorrect. So the question is then, how can we train? So in general, what you do is you kind of put many dogs pictures in and many cat pictures in. For every picture you put in, you observe the output. You see what the output is and what you wish it was, and there's some difference. And then you try to minimize that difference. And it's a little complicated. You can do this in a couple different ways. So you can kind of like randomly fiddle with the weights and see how the output changes. Or you can use more principled methods like gradient descent, where you can efficiently calculate the updates to the weights such that the difference will be minimized. And what I'll show you today, we use both of these methods for slightly different problems. I'll kind of leave it at that for now. So one reason these models are great, well, there's a couple reasons. First, they're hierarchical and compositional, which means that later computation is based on shared information from earlier computation. This is the sort of, so any features you compute here are kind of used multiple times by multiple units in the future, which tends to regularize them in sort of interesting ways, at least I think. Second, they just happen to be fairly trainable. So all of these operations are fairly simple, and you can implement them quickly on computers, which lets you, like practically speaking, push through lots and lots of images or lots of videos or text or speech or whatever kind of per second, which enables these models to be trained on very large data sets, which turns out to be kind of one of the key parts, important parts for doing machine learning well. Okay, so let's take a step back for a second. I showed you in the beginning 5 decades or 6 decades of people working on AI. I'm a grad student. I'd like to also work on AI. So if we'd like to push AI forward, kind of what problems are worth working on? As I see it, there are kind of two. Well, first, to push AI forward, we've identified that neural networks might be kind of one promising approach. They're not the only approach, but they're, I think, fairly promising. So you can imagine trying to push the field forward, you could focus on one of a couple areas. So one area is just identifying problems of interest and then training networks for them. So you have a data set, or you have a problem, or you want to make a driverless car. You take this problem as given to you. You try to assemble then a network that will kind of fit the problem well by changing the topology or the size of the initialization or the cost functions and so on. And you try to come up with a model that works well. And many people spend years on this, and I've spent a fair amount of my PhD on training networks for specific problems to see if we could make them work well. A second avenue for advancement, I think, is actually understanding networks. So this is curious property. It's been said that if you want to understand something well, you should try to build it. And people have this opinion of AI, or have had it for a long time. If we really want to understand what intelligence is, what we should do is try to build intelligent things, so make robots that can walk and drive. And once we can do that, then we will understand intelligence. As it turns out, I think, and some people would agree, we're starting to be able to build many things that work, but we don't understand them because they're just big, complicated, sort of black box neural networks. So I think a second very important thrust to eventually, building and understanding AI is this understanding portion. So I've spent a lot of my PhD also on this, designing methods that take kind of existing trained networks and just trying to make sense of them in a way that's interpretable to a human. So for the rest of the talk, I'm kind of going to give you some overview of these different areas. I'll spend a bit more time over here in general, but I'll summarize a couple of these small contributions. I'm kind of a little more excited about this part, so I'll spend more time on that. Any questions so far, I guess? Have enough coffee? Staying awake? Cool. Okay, so first I'm going to show you a quick project about this little robot. I showed up in 2010, 2011 to Hod's lab, and we had this robot sitting around, and it could kind of walk. People had coded. Oh no, the video's not. Okay, this is the robot walking via a gate that a grad student had hand coded, and it was kind of moving, but not too quickly. So we were wondering whether we could make it faster by designing a network to produce the motion automatically rather than having a human do it. So eventually we produced a let's just say a shallow neural network with parameters that can be tuned. It was a fairly small network with few parameters. And here you can see it kind of walking away. It was a bit faster than the human gait because it learned that it should take quick steps instead of slow steps. But it was ultimately not very much faster. Then we experimented with something called a deeper network called CPPNs by Ken Stanley in 2007. CPPNs are networks that have a longer distance from the input to the output, and they're allowed to have more nodes, and actually they can grow over time. So we thought this type of network would produce more coordinated motion. So actually, this is kind of silly, the robot's not moving anywhere, right? But it's flapping its legs around in a coordinated way. So like the front and back and left and right limbs move together, and they kind of are 180 degrees out of phase. So even though it's not moving, this is like a good building block for eventual motion, we thought. And eventually, after learning for a few hundred runs, here it's waving maybe. Eventually, after learning for a few hundred runs, we were able to produce what we thought was much more sort of organic seeming motion. So this is the first time we actually saw the robot doing something that resembled, what you could imagine, like the ideal gait a human might design, or like if it was an actual baby spider, how it might learn to walk. So we eventually published this. This led to a couple papers. So the first paper was at eCal in 2011, where we showed this gait I showed you here. It was eventually 9 times faster than the gait designed by a human. We also had some follow-up work with some undergrads. So Haocheng Shen showed a different parameterization could also work a little bit better. Sushan Li showed critically that if you give the robot access to a simulation of itself, it can learn faster by kind of going back and forth between the real world and the simulated world. We also ended up designing, I guess, because people like robots and they're kind of cute, the robot was eventually featured in Fast Company and also on an episode of Through the Wormhole, narrated by Morgan Freeman, where they showed him walking around and so on. But one problem we had with this study was every iteration takes a lot of time, and the motors would break quite often. So we spent some time also with a really very talented master student named Sarah Lohman, designing a new robot called Arachna. And Arachna is now 3D printable and downloadable online. It's open source. If you have a 3D printer, you could build your own whenever you like. It looks like this. It's a lot more robust. It's lighter, and it doesn't have as many of the motor burnout problems that the earlier robot had. Cool. So that's robots. I'll tell you about this project next, and I know what you're thinking maybe. So I'm not going to go through like every project one at a time for 8 minutes. That would take forever. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit more here. We're going to kind of skip this stuff and move on to the understanding networks part. But just quickly, we'll talk about this one. So we were wondering whether we could use neural networks to specify 3-dimensional shapes. And it turns out you can fairly simply. You can have a network output a function over 3 space, and then you can threshold that function, sort of take the level set, and then just show the level set, and that produces 3D shapes. Here are some randomly generated shapes created by just randomly generating networks with random weights and connections and plotting the level set they give. So to train such networks, we needed to gather a lot of data. So we decided we would just let people specify what they like and what they don't like. So we made a website called Endless Forms, where people can click on things that they like, and through this process, we train the networks. So for example, here someone has a bunch of options for different lamps. These are all generated by networks with nearby weights. So like weights that are very similar but slightly different. This generates kind of an array of lamps. And let's say that they have a hidden preference in their head. They say, I kind of like rounder lamps instead of square lamps. So they click on these kind of round versions, and they don't click on the square ones. They then click evolve, and we change the weights, change the networks, such that in the next generation, we produce more round lamps. And now maybe they say, okay, I like the ones that are contiguous, not separated, and so on and so forth. And eventually, through enough clicking and enough liking, they can generate some pretty cool shapes. So we got a lot of input from users because of being posted on a few websites. So eventually, I just checked the other day, over 5.4 million shapes have been seen by humans and clicked on. And eventually producing some shapes like this. So you see some humanoid kind of images, faces or so on. Here we see objects with a really kind of cool symmetry and repetition. So you see here symmetry in the top-down direction and the left-right direction. So this is enabled by things like the shared computation. So on earlier layers, you can produce certain features that later layers can use, for example, to kind of copy-paste and so on. Another kind of cool thing, I think, is that when you specify shapes this way, small changes to the network result in kind of sensible variations instead of maybe voxel level variations. So for example, this heart here is specified by some network, and through only a few small changes, you can change the heart into a broken heart, which is kind of like a maybe sensible variation from a human perspective. Eventually, we also ran a competition to have people evolve chess sets. So here you see different chess pieces that were evolved, and we 3D printed them then. You can see shared structure between the king and queen and bishop and so on, because the neural networks that specify them share structure. Cool. So that's this endless forms project. The website's still up if you ever want to check it out. Next, a few other papers I'm pretty excited about, but I basically can't talk very much about them just for time. I'll just briefly mention, so this paper is with Sina Onari and Chris Pal and Pascal Vincent at Montreal. We proposed a pretty cool model for combining multi-resolution data in a slightly more principled way than people have been doing it. So basically we can do deep coarse computation and then condition fine computation on that. If you do anything with pixel level predictions, you might want to check out this paper. I kind of really like the model, but again, it's a lot of great work by Sina, and I can't spend too much time on it. We did obtain state-of-the-art on 3 datasets for facial key point detection, so AFW, AFLW, and 300W. And it's another paper I worked on for a bit with Joshua and Guillaume and Eric on generative stochastic networks. I sort of did maybe only a little bit of work on the writing and some of the proofs, but I'll just mention that kind of briefly. It's a pretty cool, very general family of generative models, and their worth is sort of still being proven, perhaps. We'll see how that goes in the next few years. Okay, finally, I also worked on some projects here, which honestly, like, sort of didn't pan out at all. And normally I would leave this out of talks because you don't need to tell people like all the things you did and failed, because people fail all the time. But I mentioned this in a talk once, and someone told me later they were encouraged to hear that, you know, a reasonable fraction of projects kind of go south. So I probably spent like a whole year on like trying to model frames of Atari using independent component analysis, and trying to model 3D shapes using RBMs and so on. And you know, basically a year later, I had nothing to show for it. So I won't say more about that, except to say if you're a grad student in your second year and like also getting nothing done, it happens. Cool. So now I'm going to sort of switch to this part of the talk. So understanding models better. So something really cool happened in 2012. Any questions on the first point? Cool. Something pretty cool happened in 2012 that changed a lot of the field. So Alex Krzyzewski, Ilya Sutskever, and Jeff Hinton published a paper at NIPS 2012 showing a big convolutional neural network doing image classification on ImageNet, and it worked very well. So here's a picture of their network. The previous state-of-the-art for this problem had been 26% error, and their model obtained 15% error. This was subsequently pushed lower in the next year and lower in the next year by modifying this network in certain ways. But basically, this was a huge improvement. Just to summarize quickly what their network looks like and how it's trained. So it became sort of known as AlexNet. It has here 5 convolutional layers, which contain operations kind of looking at local regions of an image. 3 fully connected layers, eventually producing an output. So for example, you could stick an image here of a lion in the input of the network, propagate through, and eventually one neuron should fire at the end for lion. So it should be firing with a strength of 1, and all the other units should be very close to 0. The amazing thing was that it worked at all. It's also much bigger than the networks I showed you earlier. So this network has about 60 million parameters. So the cool thing is, like, it worked really well, and it got a lot of people thinking about what's actually going on inside networks and so on. But I guess we sort of quickly realized we didn't understand that much about what's going on. All we know is we put an image in, pixels, we understand pixels, and like something magical happens, and then out comes the right answer. But we don't have really very much understanding about what's going on in the network, except that it works. So I tried the very, very simple approach of just like literally plotting what's going on in the inside of the network to see if it would help at all. And through some tweaking, I eventually produced a toolbox that can be used to kind of visualize things live. And I'll show that to you now just quickly. It turned out to be, I think, fairly useful. And hopefully it will actually work. Cool. So here we have the toolbox. In the top left, we show an image that's going into, in this case, the network ImageNet. It goes through all these layers in the top, and eventually out this right side comes the answer. And here we see 100% school bus, and kind of the second place category and third place category out of 1,000 are very low, so minibus and so on. So we can see, we get the right answer for certain examples. So school bus here, 100%. Zebra classified as 100%. Maltese Terrier classified as 76%, so it is correct, but it's slightly less confident. Yorkshire Terrier, so you can tell the difference between these like subtle variations of dogs. Okay, so this is the network's getting the right answer.
So,
Yep.
convolutional layers are essentially very small kernel matrices that you scan over the image and generate another output matrix that is the same size as the image itself.
It can be, or it can be bigger, or more often it's slightly smaller.
Okay, it just seems like everything's the same size. I was wondering what exactly is going to be.
Yeah, okay, I'll explain more detail, I think. So what we have is, so this is the input image in pixel space. So it's about 200 pixels by 200 pixels. And there's three channels.
So can you turn the camera just a little bit so that we can see the entire,
Yeah, sure, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you.
So the input layer is pixels, 3 color channels each. This is the first convolutional layer, which is like one layer of computation removed from the input. And it contains a bunch of, you can think of it like a bunch of little pictures. In this case, there are 55 pixels by 55 pixels. And instead of 3 channels or 1 channel, there are many channels, so there are 96. We can also, I'll show you a little bit what they're looking for in a second. So we can also use the webcam as input. I'll turn off the class labels for a second. So we can use the webcam as input. And by playing with the input, we can try to figure out kind of a little bit of what's going on in this layer. So for example, usually I try something black. So here, this is weird. Actually, I'm using this camera to broadcast, and I guess it's also using it for the toolbox. I didn't think about that. So here you see my dark phone on the left, and you see this one unit firing. You see this unit firing here, kind of showing that it responds very strongly to this edge from dark to light. And we can kind of play around with other pictures and other things and see what other units fire for. There's actually kind of an easy way to visualize what this first layer wants to see, though. We can just literally plot the weights in the space of the kernels, and we can see what they want to see. So here, this is like this one is liking to see kind of a dark edge that turns into a light region, and that's why it fires at the edge of my phone, right? The one next to it fires the opposite type of edge, and so if I show, all right, we see that unit firing, and then as we move the phone over, we eventually see the other unit firing from the other side of the phone. See? Okay, cool. So this is the first layer. Like I said, we can kind of plot this and kind of get a handle for what's going on. In general, it's a bit harder to figure out what's happening for higher layers because the computation is more complicated. This is basically a linear function of input pixels. Higher layers, functions are highly nonlinear, so it's quite a lot harder to understand. But still, the nice thing about plotting activations is we can just plot them. So here's the convolutional layer. Here we have a first pooling layer, so you think things get lower resolution and blockier because we pool over spatial regions. This is designed to produce invariance to input changes. We have contrast normalization, second convolutional layer, third, fourth, fifth. So by the fifth layer, we still have activations firing and so on, but again, we've had 5 layers of parameters, 5 layers of nonlinearity, well, also max pooling, so additional nonlinearity. And the functions being expressed here are much more complicated. If we poke around, we can kind of see some cool stuff. So for example, one of the units I like a lot is here. So this unit here is sort of human face detector. So I can pause it right there, maybe zoom in. So this fires for regions of the input that contain human faces. So you can see my face there. I won't try to turn, well, why not actually? If we like turn the camera to face other people, you can see Jeff, hey Jeff. We can see it responding for multiple faces. Eventually the faces are sort of too small and it fails to respond. But as a whole, this is kind of cool. So we can learn something simple just like plotting the activations. We see human faces, that's kind of interesting. One reason it's interesting is that there are no labeled human faces in the data set. So it's not like we told this network to learn to detect human faces. Instead, we told it to learn to detect things like lions and cowboy hats and seat belts and fire trucks and so on. We never explicitly told it to learn about human faces. It learns about them just because that feature ends up being useful for later computation. So for example, one of the classes is seatbelt. So you have thousands of pictures of like seatbelts on a person usually. So what's a seatbelt, right? It's kind of like a black stripe. It's actually pretty nondescript in pixel space. But if you see a black stripe sort of diagonally beneath the human face, then maybe it's a seatbelt, not just a stripe. So this is kind of cool evidence that networks are learning some great representations on the inside. Let's see what else. There are other units in here that are really interesting. So another that I like is right here. So this unit actually learns to detect text in a variety of colors and backgrounds and so on. So if I show some, so here you see it fires for the writing on this notebook. And it kind of doesn't care whether it's light on black or black on white or white on red or something like that. So we thought this was kind of cool. Basically, just by plotting things, we can see a lot about what's going on. If you look at higher layers, you can see the output pixels or the output units. So eventually, this is the output layer. So this is where we have that unit that should say whether it's a lion or a zebra or whatnot. So here, like this is the school bus unit firing with a strength of 1, everything else 0, and zebra and so on.
Which network exactly is this? Is this the AlexNet?
This is AlexNet. Yeah. Yeah, this is AlexNet. Yeah. Okay, so basically by just plotting things, we can learn kind of a fair amount. I also think this tool is maybe useful for people that are getting into networks for the first time. So understanding just how convolution works, how the filters could be visualized and thought about, and so on. Okay, back to the other. So we think this is helpful for understanding what's going on, but it provides sort of only an intuitive understanding of some aspects of the network. And it's sort of like a microscope. So you can kind of focus in on one unit at a time and examine it. But there's so much going on. There are literally 60 million numbers that you have to try to maybe understand. And this is just fundamentally difficult. So the next project I'll tell you about focuses on trying to more quantitatively understand some of the computational properties of a network. And what we're going to do is instead of examining a single unit at a time, we're going to examine kind of an entire layer's representational power at a time. So this is work that was published at NIPS in 2014 with Jeff and Joshua and Had. So to give you an idea about what we tried to do in this study, here we have kind of a diagram of AlexNet that I just showed you operating. I showed you on the first layer, so the functions that are computed are these, what we call actually Gabor filters. They're simple edge detectors and blobs of color. We kind of know that's what's happening in the beginning. And at the end, we also sort of know what's happening because we trained the network to do something specific. So we trained it to detect lions or school buses and so on. So we know what's going on here. But we kind of want to know what's going on in the middle as well. So one way to think about this type of computation is to imagine we kind of stick these layers. So we have a plot of, on x-axis, which layer it is. On the y-axis, how general the features are or how specific they are. In particular, we can imagine sticking these Gabor filters way at the top, saying these features, these edges are very general. So like lions are composed of different types of edges, and zebras are, and school buses are, and people are. On a pixel level, the statistics of a variety of pictures are very similar. So these filters are very general, and it turns out they're actually learned by many networks trained on many tasks. And this is sort of a fact in the field that people have come to accept for many networks. On the other hand, this lion neuron is inherently very specific to the task. So we said you should detect lions, not something else. So we know that this is specific. So in this study, we kind of want to ask and answer the question, how does the computation transition from general in the beginning to specific at the end? It's like sort of general for a long time and eventually specializes at the last layer. Or do things quickly specialize in the beginning or something in between? So the main idea of the study is we want to kind of measure this transition. And we're going to do so by using what's called transfer learning. So transfer learning is where you train a network on one task, and then you reuse or repurpose part of it for another task. And I'll explain more about that in a second. I should also note that if we have some intuition about how this works, it's very useful to know, because maybe you want to be able to use the first 4 layers of your network, which maybe you decide are general, thanks to the results of our study. Maybe then you can use those for another task where you learn specific outputs for not lions, but something else. So to do this study, what we do is we start with ImageNet, which is a big data set I mentioned earlier, with 1.3 million images in each of in a total of 1,000 classes. We split the data set into 2 parts. So we're going to call these data set A and data set B, each containing 500 different classes. And then we do something fairly simple. So we start with our AlexNet network. We train a network on the A data set. So we put a bunch of A images in, we train it to predict A labels, and eventually when we're done, we have sort of a trained A network. We repeat the same process for B, giving us 2 networks. So we have a trained A network and a trained B network. Okay, so the first question we could ask is, how well do these networks perform at their individual tasks? So, can this network actually correctly classify the 500 images or the 500 classes, and can this network? And so we can just look at the accuracy over several runs of training, and here's the accuracy we see. So here's top 1 accuracy, higher is better. So these dots represent the accuracies on the test set for randomly sampled 8 networks or so. So we see it's around 63% on average. Okay, so now let's get back to what we're trying to measure. So we take this network, and we're going to do something sort of interesting to it. We're going to take the first 2 layers, keep them, and we're going to throw away everything else. So we're just keeping the parameters that are learned on, say, the first 2 layers. We're going to freeze those parameters and use them to initialize another network of the same shape. But then we're going to take this network and train it on the B data set. So train it on the other images that these parameters never saw. We're going to try to train that, and eventually we'll have these parameters optimized for the B data set. So what's the idea here? The idea is that if these features on this level are generic, so if they're good for many tasks, if they're good for A or B, then this network will do just as well as this network, which was trained just for B from the beginning. On the other hand, if this network starts suffering and starts performing poorly compared to this one, we'll know that these features really had to do with the A data set. So maybe they had to do with learning lions and zebras, but not so much with learning like trucks and cars and things. So if we look at the performance of these networks, here's what we see. So so this is the performance of training a bespoke network for a specific target task. Here's the performance if we copy 1 layer from sort of like the wrong task and then train on so we copy it from the A task and train it on the B task. And we see that the performance is basically the same, which is what we expected. So these Gabor filters and so on are, they're generic. So they work just as well for this set of images as for this set of images. This was sort of known or assumed before, and we can just measure it more clearly now. We also find that for the first couple layers, for the first maybe 2 or 3, the performance is also fairly generic. So performance does not suffer when you train the features on the wrong data set, which is sort of interesting. Eventually, performance starts to degrade, and by the last layer, our performance has dropped a fair amount. So this network here is if you copy 7 layers from the wrong data set, and you literally just train the last layer, which is just kind of a linear classifier, based on features from the other data set. So one thing to note is that this is like relatively high above 0. So this is 63% up here. This drops only to about 54%. We have a long way to go to 0. So the fact that this works so well is interesting. I'll say something more about that at the end. Well, basically, one reason it works so well is that our data sets A and B are kind of fairly similar. We'll look later at how this changes when they're dissimilar. Second, we saw some interesting behavior here in its intermediate region, and this is a detail I'll probably not get into too fully, But we saw this as evidence of some other type of phenomenon, and eventually we figured out how to measure that phenomenon by training on only the second half of the data set. And we found this interesting story where in the beginning, features are fairly generic and anyone can kind of fit a new network to them. At the very end, features are very specific to a task, but they're also very simple to use. And kind of in the middle, there's this slightly awkward region where not only are the features starting to become specialized for one task versus the other, they're also very brittlely adapted to each other. So to give a Star Trek style analogy, you basically have neurons on subsequent layers in a normal network all learning together. So they start out untrained and they slowly converge all together. What happens then is if you take half of those features, keep them and like try to retrain something else on top of them, it works fairly poorly to this extent. This is a bit like if you have, okay, imagine two kids growing up together and like learning to ice skate, like pair ice skate very well together. So they start out without much skill and they slowly learn together. And by the time they're older and more skilled at ice skating, they kind of like know each other's subtle cues very well and they work very well together. So that's, you know, high performance. Now imagine you remove one of the pair and replace them with a complete novice, and you try to get the novice to learn to interpret these very subtle cues being sent by the other person, or the other neuron in this case. It turns out that that process doesn't work so well, and by using this method, we can kind of measure that. So practically speaking, for people that want to use, yeah.
Sorry, I don't have a question, but actually somebody telling me the live speak.
Ah, that's sad.
Can you repeat the question?
Sorry, just someone mentioned that maybe the streaming had failed. Although it says it's going right here. Let me just.
Streaming has been not working for one.
Ah, that's unfortunate. Let me just check very quickly. That's sad. Let me just.
Streaming has been.
I bet it's something to do with the fact that I used the camera.
Check the